all. Thank you all for the wonderful questions. We are right on time. I would like to start with the next session presenter and welcome our esteemed speaker, Charles Hopkins. He holds the UNESCO Chair in Reorienting Education Towards Sustainability at York University, also serving the UN Global Education 2030 Agenda. Charles is advisor to the global network of RCEs, the Regional Centers of Expertise for Education on Sustainable Development, associated with the UN University. And he's also the co-director of the Asia Pacific Institute on ESD in Beijing, China. He has been a great mentor, a great support for RCEs across the world, especially RCE in North Texas. And it's always a pleasure to listen to him talk so passionately about education for sustainable development. So I'm very grateful for his time. Thank you, Charles. Take it away.
Well, thank you very much for the opportunity to be here and to share the stage with Dr. Tripathi. It's indeed an honor, and congratulations on this, I guess the second anniversary, right?
Yeah. Did we just?
Yeah. Well, we lost audio. Just a moment.
Charles, we lost audio. Can you try again? You were fine in the beginning, and then it went away.
Okay. Try unmuting your microphone again. You should be able to.
Yeah.
There you go. Sorry about that.
We can hear you.
Okay. Good. Is my screen still presenting?
Yes.
Yes.
I'm seeing it anyway.
All right. Then we'll just we'll continue on then. Okay. What I would like to do is to build on what Dr. Tripathi was sort of mentioning, and then link it more into the RCEs and the idea of education for sustainable development. Now, as sorry. All right. So the first point that I wanted to make was that where it really is it's serious, and we do need to move on this. And those of us who have been working in this field for some time, even back in the 1990s, we could sort of see what is coming, and then trying to build programs to address it. Okay, yes, it is serious, but there's also opportunity. Those of us who are in the field of education realize, and especially those who are in business, I think you need to realize that these are the big issues that are not going to go away easily. These are huge issues that are going to be around a long time. And so while they are challenges, they will also shape the future of the world's economy in many ways. And in our education systems, especially in higher education and in training programs in the private sector, we would really be doing our students and our workers a disfavor if we do not address this within the context of what we're doing. Anyone who is graduating MBAs who do not understand the cost of carbon, you are not training them properly, and that goes through for pretty well all of our aspects. So let me again put this in a context. We have always been trying to work together to address the issues that a single country really cannot address. So even at the end of the Second World War, pulling together the United Nations as a place where nations themselves could come together and talk about how they can plan to work collaboratively to address giant issues. So, for instance, the whole idea of education, how we can collaboratively work. UNESCO was one of the very first of the UN agencies formed right after the Second World War, and around the motto of sort of, since wars begin in the minds of men and women, it is in the minds of men and women that the defenses of peace must be constructed. And so it was the idea of using education, public awareness, training, education in that broad, formal, non-formal, informal sphere as a way of addressing global issues. And so it was that in the 1980s, mid-80s, where they saw the clash coming between the roughly 20% of the people who live in the developed world, living a very nice life, and at the same time, almost 80% of the world's population who lived in the former colonies that were set free, now called developing countries, that they wanted the same lifestyle. They wanted development. And so there was the clash between environmentalism, environmental protection, and the need to address poverty and so on. So the idea that came out of this, how do we address this in a concerted way, was the concept of sustainable development, as outlined in Our Common Future, the Brundtland Report, and so on. And if you're attending this, you would know about this webinar, you know about these things, right? But embedded in it, right in the preface, Brundtland addressed the idea that we needed to engage education. But the concept, adopting the concept in 1987, that did not solve it. All that did was say, we need an action plan. We need to do things. We need to move beyond talk. And so the world's first action plan was called Agenda 21. It had 40 chapters and a whole chapter, chapter 36, addressing education, public awareness, and training. And then in getting ready for the Millennium Development Goals, this was sort of a retraction from Agenda 21, which engaged all countries. They decided to focus on the least developed countries with foreign aid and investment and try to work forward with that. They reduced it to 8 goals, one of them being education. But we realized that that was a setback. And while there was some progress, we still needed to address all countries and engage. And they had to engage in a vision that people wanted, not something that was imposed by national governments or by the UN or you know, the agreements that come out of the United Nations discussions with nations. So it was a huge campaign, went globally, not quite so much in the United States, but around the world. There was huge campaigns called The World We Want, and hundreds of thousands of people took part in visioning a sustainable future. And that went on from 2012 to 2015. That is what formed the Sustainable Development Goals. It was collaboration with the world. So we come up with those 17 goals that I think you've all seen. And what is now an extremely common image of the 17 goals, the idea, once again, education in its broadest sense, education, public awareness, and training was going to be key. A very, very aspirational goal. Now, there's 2 ways of looking at it. You can look at education in the singular as one of them, but just think of the image of a patchwork quilt. One patch, it helps a bit, but really you need the whole quilt. These things are all interrelated. If you look at the current COVID one, the UN has put out how each of the Sustainable Development Goals plays a role and is integral into the whole thing. So the idea then of what is the agenda that really constitutes the contribution of education to the Sustainable Development Goals and really understanding Sustainable Development Goals is just the current implementation program. The big issue is a sustainable future itself. Right? So the idea of ensuring an inclusive and equitable quality education for all, and lifelong learning, which really brings in that training aspects, and community development, community public awareness, and so on. And of of course, as Dr. Tripathi mentioned, each of the goals has targets and indicators. And one of the targets is the idea that of education for sustainable development being the way of moving forward, and that every citizen should have education around sustainable development and around global citizenship. So what then is really education for sustainable development? And it is, I would like to say, I was involved in the late 1980s and 1990s is writing the chapter on Agenda 21. And we had long debates. Did we want to create something like environmental education, peace education, sustainability education, and try and squeeze it into the already overloaded curriculum? And we decided totally against that. What we wanted to do was to simply use the world's education, public awareness, and training systems and put in a sustainable future as a purpose of these programs and not something separate. Now, it's fine if they do come out with educators who are really focusing on how do you talk about sustainability, and trainers and so on, learning their particular discipline. But basically, we want this holistic approach of embedding it totally right across it. But the unique thing that has come out is that the United Nations, the General Assembly, on 2 occasions in 2017 and again in 2019, reiterated that it was education for sustainable development was central to the implementation of all of the other SDGs. So UNESCO, as Dr. Tripathi mentioned, who is the lead UN agency on education for sustainable development, has come forward with a framework and now a roadmap on moving forward. And this is the one that really is targeted towards the RCEs. This is where our link really comes in. The roadmap will be launched in Berlin in May, shortly, and in it comes up with 5 priority action areas. So the first one is transforming learning environments. And already around the world, universities and school systems and so on are looking at how to embed the notion of sustainable development within the learning environments. The second is building the capacity of educators, because so many people need to figure out ways of how are you going to address it. Another one is advancing policy, so that it is not just sort of a passing fantasy. The fourth is empowering youth. And then 5th, accelerating local level action. This is where the RCEs, the United Nations University Program, this is at the heart of the UNESCO program. And so there's great collaboration between UNESCO, UNU, and the 179 RCEs that are around the world. Now, a word about forming the RCEs. The idea in the beginning was trying to address, in around the year 2000, the rector of the United Nations University, and I was privileged to be with him when we were discussing how sad it was that nations were into negotiation. I'll do this if you do that, and things were moving so slowly. So the idea that we come up with was how can we eliminate this negotiation and just look at, if we brought it down to the community level, where people could make their own informed decisions and move forward. So the idea was to bring together two main groups: the educators in the community, not just universities, schools, and so on, but the NGOs, the corporate trainers, the museums, and so on in the area, bring them together with the people who knew what are the sustainability issues facing the community now and what's largely coming in the future. Urban planners, researchers, and so on. And how could you get local, actual, real information into the hands of the educators? And so that is what was sort of behind the context. And we were looking at how this information and the goals of the RCEs aligned with the 4 areas of education for sustainable development. So the goals of the RCEs of reorienting education towards addressing sustainable development, to increase the quality of education, leaving no one behind in the area. You need an informed public to have any kind of development, let alone sustained development. How do you build the training programs, and how do you actually raise public awareness so you have an informed society that will be able to perform their civic duties and vote in an enlightened and knowledgeable way? So these align almost perfectly with the 4 major thrusts of education for sustainable development. The first being access and retention in quality education, which are targets SDG 4, but targets 1 to 6. And the second, reorienting our existing education and training systems, because it's our most educated countries that are leaving the deepest ecological footprints. And so the idea of more education as we currently have in the developed world is not the answer. We need to reorient the purpose and then figure out, what does that really mean? What do we change? And then again, public awareness and training. So there is that sort of alignment. Now, when we create the RCEs, and 179 of them, Canada, there are 6 up here in Canada. I'm speaking to you from Toronto. The United States has 10, and Mexico 2, and scattered around Latin America, there are 9 more. We work together in a regional collaboration, and have now with Zoom and so on, we can hold our meetings. We share programs, we share our expertise and newsletters. And when something we call the global learning space is we share our research, share our publications, and so on. The latest one is this one that's out from Asia. It's a multi-stakeholder approaches to education for sustainable development in local communities. Now, as Dr. Tripathi pointed out, universities are moving. The International Association of Universities, for instance, has put together a network of universities clustering around each of the 17 Sustainable Development Goals. So they have 17 of these networks that are focusing on the contribution of higher education. Higher education is so important because, globally speaking, between 6 and 7% of the world's population gets to go to higher education. But they will become largely the shapers of the world, whether it's through the private sector, the public sector, through the leaders in faith-based groups, in culture, the philosophers, the writers, the poets, and so on. So it is really a target group. And universities understand their responsibility. My university, at York University, here in Toronto, has wrapped the SDGs all around all of our strategic planning. So we refer to it as a whole institution approach. It's not only what we teach, it's what we research, it's about our community service. It's about looking at the university. Our university is 55,000. That's the size of a small town. But our university can be seen as a living laboratory. We can measure the changes in water consumption. We can look at experiments in eco-efficiency and so on, and turn it back. So universities are extremely important, but they are, and while they're at the heart of the RCEs, because the idea came out of the United Nations University, the university in itself can't do much. What we need to do is to build the university and civil society, its networks, all of these other institutions. Where does the university get accurate information in a local context? Because that is what is really going to make the difference. So one of the things we've learned, and I'm glad Dr. Tripathi mentioned climate change, because climate change has informed us of ways of looking at sustainability issues. The first being prevention. We see what is coming and can identify, how do we prevent? The second then being mitigation. How do we minimize the impact of what is going to happen? And thirdly, adoption. How do we start early on to realize how do we adapt to the reality? How are we going to prepare our farmers who, because of climate change, for instance, are going to have to buy new machinery, plant different crops, the growing season is shifting, opportunities are changing, and so on. So we can take that, whether these three, whether it is migration of humans, as we are going to see as more and more of the planet becomes uninhabitable, we need to do that. If we look at the range of implementing education for sustainable development and so on in the formal education sector, in K through 12 and on into universities, we see the different ways of embedding it. And you will see that, unfortunately, the first step that in far too many is to ignore it and say, I'm sorry, we're focusing on math and language scores, which is, it's important. But math and language is not the purpose of education. These are tools, and we need them to be as sharp and know how to use them, but it's not the purpose of education systems. At any rate, moving from ignoring to events and clubs and so on, then on up into teaching about sustainable development, but then eventually making the shift, education for sustainable development. And then at the height, it's not only the school systems, but the entire community, and hence the idea of the regional centers of expertise being so important. In closing, let me talk about a neat story that again came out of India. I thought this would be useful, Magna. We all know of the ecological footprint. It's an idea that came out of the University of British Columbia, and a number of years ago, an economist, Dr. Bill Rees and his grad student came up with the idea of the ecological footprint. And now, I guess it's 7 years ago, in Hyderabad, a little girl in grade 4, the grade 4 teacher was talking about the ecological footprint. And of course, these children in poor area didn't have much, their footprint was not that deep. But at any rate, the little girl said to the teacher, but I have hands. I can do something about my footprint. And the teacher recognized something about the metaphor. And so she had the kids do the handprints. And she took that concept of the ecological handprint linked to the ecological footprint. And she took that to a big non-government organization called the Center for Environmental Education in India. The NGO took that idea, originated in the school, partnered in the community, and went to the government, to the Ministry of Environment. And with funding, they have launched what is now global, sort of the concept of the ecological handprint. 3 days ago, the Foundation for Environmental Education in Denmark, which runs the largest eco-school network in the world, have now linked the idea of the ecological handprint to the Sustainable Development Goals. It is the idea that from local, small ideas, great ideas around the Sustainable Development Goals will emanate. Thank you very much for this opportunity to be here and to be with you today. I really wish you well for the rest of the day. The other presenters look really exciting. I'm looking forward to it. And congratulations again to RCE North Texas. Thanks, Magna.
Thank you so much, Jack. Thank you so much for your time. We are very grateful. We are right on time, so we'll take a quick 10 minutes break and come back here to start the first panel discussion at 9:45. Please take a moment to fill out the survey that I'll post in the chat window, and it's available throughout the day.